The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome. Sorry we had a sound issue there. Welcome to Unit 6 of the Lunch and Learn series on developing team culture. Could I just ask you to type in the word clear just in the question box to make sure that I'm coming across loud and clear? That would be great, just to make sure that everything's working according to plan. Okay. Thanks, Julie. Anybody else? Okay. Thanks, John. Sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear. All right, good. I'm going to be giving you, of course, a copy of the slides and the presentation at the end of this, so you'll get that. So I've enjoyed working with you throughout this series, so I'm looking forward to today as a way of just capping off, looking at the whole process of developing teams. So, and of course, at any time today you've got questions or comments or observations, please, I'm all ears. You type them into the question box there, and I will deal with them as soon as I come across them. Okay, so all good. So let's get underway, and let's look at the program that we have been covering. So you can see there, of course, that we have covered a number of different topics in the Lunch and Learn series, and you can see that we've got down to the last time, at least, we were talking about managing team conflict and negotiations, and I hope you got something really useful out of that, and to understand that there are 5 different ways of being able to deal with different conflict. So we started off at the very beginning talking about the 8 different characteristics of high-performing teams, and the whole purpose of that was to attempt to give you some areas to work on in terms of improving the performance of your team. We looked at Tuckman's model, the 4 stages of team development in Unit 2, and we're really looking at moving the team on to the next phase. So, starting off where they were, the forming, the norming, the performing, and so forth. And of course, it's each stage has its own challenge. We talked about tools for leading teams, and really what I was talking about there very much was around the leadership tools that are required in teamwork. And really the essence of that session was really to talk about balancing task and relationship, and to make sure we're not too much one or the other, which is very important. And we talked in Unit 2, we looked at the roles that people play in teams, and essentially what we were talking about there is the fact that Meredith Belbin was the scholar who came up with this notion and researched this notion that people often, when they join teams, will actually play a particular role in the team. Sometimes they're not even aware of the role that they're playing. It's a sort of a subconscious thing. And I shared with you 8 particular roles that people play, and that was based very much on the team management systems methodology. And if you're interested in doing any of that with your team, I can certainly help you facilitate that. And then last time we talked about team conflict and negotiation, and the fact that there are 5 different ways of dealing with conflict. So that's pretty much where we got to, and now we're up to, of course, developing team culture. And this was the model that I shared with you last time we met, and you'll note that the model was is you can see that it's based on the parameters of assertiveness and cooperativeness. So you've got 5 particular ways of dealing with conflict, and we went through those 5, and I shared with you some scenarios, and so that you had an opportunity to consider a number of different scenarios in local government or anywhere for that matter, and to work out where you might fit in the grid at different times. And of course, there was a diagnostic that would show you what perhaps your preferred style is. And the whole idea of this is to really try using a whole range of different approaches. By using a whole range of different approaches, you're far more likely to be successful than you would if you just stuck to your preferred approach, because each situation has its strength and each situation also has its weaknesses as well. All right, so that's what we went through, and then your homework, of course, was to practice those 5 things. So I hope you've had a chance to do that. And try a different approach, and if a plan A doesn't work, as I mentioned a fortnight ago, to try a plan B or a C even, or even a D. So by using a variety of different approaches and being flexible, it's likely that you'll be much more effective at dealing with conflict and generally in negotiation. So that was really the essence of what we talked about. So I hope you've had a chance to do that. So let's move on to today's session and talk a little bit about culture. Now, there's a lot of material out there on what workplace culture is and organisational culture and so forth, and for good reason, because we want to create a good culture inside our local government authority or wherever it is. And it's interesting that I get to travel around Queensland a lot, and I go to different councils, and what I find really interesting is that each of them in their own way have a different culture. There are, of course, a fair degree of overlay in terms of local government in general, but what I do find, interestingly enough, is that each organisation does have its own culture, unique culture, and you in your organisation have a unique culture as well. So I'm going to give you a chance to reflect on that today, but particularly in the context of your team and what you might be able to do there. So to start the process, we're going to talk about what culture is and what it isn't. Just have a bit of a reflection on that. And then I'm going to give you a lot of strategies to develop team culture, give you an opportunity to start looking at your team and develop some strategies around that. And I'm going to finish up the session on team identity, which I think is a very important approach, that if you look at any team that's performing well, they have a very distinct identity. And not only that, they identify with that. Team members actually identify with the team. So you can actually create that team identity, and you need to be doing a number of things in order to do that. And I'm going to share with you what 3 elements of that might be at the end of this presentation. So that's what we're covering in the next hour. And as I said before, if you've got any questions or statements or observations, please. And you've been a fantastic group. You've been very participatory so far, so don't stop now. And I'll stop the presentation and respond immediately to your question or your comment or your observation. Now, while you might be thinking that through, let's talk about what a definition of culture is. Now, this is my definition, but you can pick up several different books and you will find that they will have different definitions. My definition is simple as this. It is really saying that as a culture, excuse me for a moment, I'm just going to turn that off so I don't distract. That's fine. Okay, so culture is the basic pattern of sharing assumptions, values, and beliefs considered to be the correct way of thinking about and acting on problems and opportunities facing the team. All right, so it's a pattern, so it's behaviour that we see on a regular basis. It is behaviour that is shared by nearly everybody in the team, most people in the team. It is considered to be the so-called correct way of going about things, or the correct way of thinking about things. And so where, of course, does this culture come from? Because we know that it's real, and we can just look at any team and we can see that it's very real. Okay. So if you go into any organisation, whether it's local government or anywhere for that matter, and you will notice something interesting, that if you think about the concept of an iceberg, and usually when you think about an iceberg, there's a tip of the iceberg that's out of the water, and of course the majority of the iceberg is below the water. And so that's how, of course, the Titanic got into trouble, because the tips of the iceberg weren't very apparent, but of course the damage was the large icebergs with the ice under the water. But nevertheless, if you look at culture, and you'll notice that above the water there are some very obvious things about culture. Perhaps it's the way the organisation is physically laid out. Perhaps it's the organisational structure, and usually in local government it's very much siloed, as we know. Perhaps it's the language that's used. I'm not talking about I'm talking about just the way people refer to each other. Is it a formal or informal environment? What sort of rituals go on, and so forth? And some organisations have really interesting rituals. And what are the stories that you hear, and the legends and so forth? And all of that is above the waterline, because it's very apparent. I mean, you only have to look at uniforms that people wear, for example. All of those things are overt characteristics of the culture of the workplace. But where it's very interesting is below the waterline, because below the waterline you have things that are not quite so apparent. So the things that people believe, the values that people uphold, and the assumptions that people make about various things. So below the waterline, of course, are where it's very interesting, because these are often the way people think, and it's not very obvious. So unless you've been in an organisation for a period of time, or your team for a period of time, it won't become obvious what those things are, certainly not on the surface at least. So that's a little bit of a definition, a bit of an overview of culture. So now a lot of people say, we're trying to create a positive culture. Every single team anywhere in the world, anywhere doing anything, has a culture attached to it, right? So culture is just part and parcel with people coming together. So therefore, it's a question of perhaps changing the culture. And I'll never forget, and many of you were intimately involved in the amalgamations in local government when they occurred in Queensland a few years ago. And what that essentially meant was that we might have in some cases had 4 or even 5 different local government authorities coming together to create a region. And the problem that we had in lots of those cases, and perhaps even still, is that it was perceived that each of those would join together to form a bigger council. And I think that's entirely the wrong way to look at it. What was actually happening is that we were creating a new organisational entity from the resources of 4 or 5 different existing councils. So therefore, it was not that we were joining cultures together. What we should have been talking about was actually creating a new culture of where the resources were coming from several different entities. And so because that wasn't done particularly well, you had some councils who there was a lot of argy-bargy about whether we've got a better system than you've got, and there was bartering around, we'll take your system but we'll use this. So there was all that kind of thing going on, instead of senior teams coming together and just saying, look, let's now carve out what we want this new regional entity to look like. Anyway, we won't go too far down that road. I'm sure many of you would have lots of interesting war stories about that would always be of interest. Now, the other point about culture is the question about why we have a culture. Now, why does a team have a culture? Now, we all know they do have a culture, but the question is, why do they have a culture? There's some very, very important human needs that cultures do address, and what we want to do now is have a look at some of those needs, because it's important to understand why we have these things. So if you start at 12 o'clock, you'll see it serves as a sense-making and a control mechanism. By having a culture, we know what's conventional and unconventional. We know what's appropriate and inappropriate. We know what's acceptable and unacceptable. So we can get a very quick gauge. So if I'm a new member to your team and I come into your team, in a very quick way, I'm going to be able to work out what I'm going to be able to make sense of my experience in your team by understanding some of the cultural traits that occur. And I might observe some of those things. I might be told some of those things, but nevertheless, I'm going to come to terms with what the culture is and make sense of it and know and feel safe in what's appropriate and inappropriate in terms of your team. Going around clockwise now, it does define the boundaries around our team. So I might go to another team and find there's a different culture, but in your team, there's a certain type of culture that we need to accept and adopt. So it creates a boundary. So any team actually has a boundary around it, what I call a psychological boundary. And of course, if that boundary is too strong, then they have divorced themselves from the rest of the organisation. But on the other hand, if it's a little too weak, the team doesn't have a clear identity. So part of a good team leader's role is to create the boundary, but not to make it so obvious and so clear that the boundary means that it's divorced itself from the rest of the organisation. Not a good thing. It creates a sense of identity. So as I mentioned before, you actually have a sense of identity because being part of this team means what? So if you look at a military environment like the SAS, clearly there's a very clear sense of identity to belong to the SAS. And they've very much manufactured and nurtured that identity. So it also provides people or injects a commitment beyond self-interest. So by having a culture, people can actually do things beyond themselves in the interests of maintaining or promoting the current culture that's already there, or not doing something that might be counter to the culture. All right. And then, of course, culture creates stability because people know where they stand, and human beings have a very strong need to know where they stand. And of course, culture is part of that. So we get some interesting reasons for that, and that's why we have a strong driver. So you can't avoid it. The question we've really got to ask ourselves then, of course, is how do we create a culture that is actually productive, and what do we as team leaders need to do to create that sort of culture? That's the question that I want to focus on now that we've just looked at that. So if you've got any comments or questions, I'm happy to field those. So go for your life. But I want to share with you, while you might be thinking that through, an exercise. Well, there's a couple of exercises I'm going to share with you that are very, very powerful. This is my favorite. And this exercise is really, really insightful. So what I suggest you do is you get your team aside for a period of time. Maybe you devote half a meeting or even a full meeting to this. And you actually ask each person, so you give them a chance to think about this, of course, but you actually say to people, if you had to describe our team, or your team, our team, as a colour, what colour would it be and why? All right. So in other words, the colour is a metaphor for explaining what they notice about the team. And then you ask them another question. You ask them 3 questions. You ask people to start thinking about this. So they might write it down. Well, you give them space, or maybe even before the meeting, you might give them a chance to think this through. So if you had to describe your team as an animal, what animal would it be and why? So it might be a leopard or, an elephant or whatever, and why? And if you had to describe your team as a motor vehicle, what vehicle would it be and why? Now, let me give you some examples where I've done this in organisations beyond local government, just to give you a flavour of how this might work. I was consulting to IBM when IBM was big, many years ago, when IBM really was as big as it gets, and they had a pretty good self-esteem. Their culture was pretty positive. It was a real winner type culture. And there was a team I was working with in IBM, and I asked them the question, if you had to describe your team as a colour, what colour would it be and why? And the prevailing colour that I got back was gold. And why? Because we're number one. I asked them to describe their team as an animal, what would it be and why? And they came back with a cheetah. Why? Because we're fast, agile, quick to market. I asked them to describe their team as a motor vehicle. What would it be and why? And they said a Ferrari with all the bells and whistles. Fast, sleek, dynamic, expensive, all those things. And so you see that team's culture was very quickly developed by asking those three questions. Now, let's go to the other end of the continuum. Many, many years ago, I was doing a job for Queensland Rail, and I asked a team in Queensland Rail what they thought. And this was at a time of very low morale. So the colour was black. I said, why? And they said, because we're pretty dull. We just do our job. Others said, black hole, things go missing. So it was a pretty sort of, it was completely the contrary to IBM. I said, what colour would you describe your team? Sorry, what animal would you describe your team? And they said, elephant. Slow to change was the obvious answer. And another one said, we also carry grudges we never forget. And I said, what about the vehicle? And at that time, and still is the case, that it was very much that my father worked here, and it's pretty much still a male-dominated environment. My grandfather worked here, I work here, and so the Holden was the vehicle that was selected because of the family connotations. So it's a really fascinating way of being able to get a handle on the culture. So what I suggest you do is that you ask your team to list these down and then to actually explain in a team meeting what they believe. And you'll find some obvious common themes running through, which is very, very interesting. Now, if you're keen to take this as an improvement process, you can then say to your team, all right, let's imagine that we could be any colour, any animal, and any vehicle we choose. What would it be and why? So in other words, this is the aspirational aspect of what we want in the team. So you give everyone a chance to do that. And I suspect what will happen is that there will be a gap between where you are and where you need to be. In other words, it won't be the same thing, and nor should it be. And that's a good thing, because now you've got some clear aspirations to a new culture. So we just got a comment here. We all have to make the conversation real. No one has to change, but we all have to have the conversation. Absolutely, yeah, and it's really important to have that conversation, and this is just another way of doing it, Edward, that can be very, very powerful. Because if you sat down and you said to someone, how would you describe our team? What culture would you describe our team? People will look at you in a very strange way. They won't have an answer for you. But interesting enough, if you ask them if you could describe our team as an animal, what would it be and why? they'll have something for you. And that's why this is very powerful, this exercise. So you get some aspirational, and then of course the next question you need to ask is, what do we need to do to go from where we are to where we need to be, which is what you are aspiring to? What do we need to do? What do I need to do as a team leader? What do you need to do as a team member? What do we need to do collectively in order to get to where we aspire to be? That's a great conversation. So it's a great way of you being able to make sense of culture by asking those three questions. So that's a fantastic exercise, and I strongly recommend that you try that one out in your team, and it works really, really well, and it's fun, and you will have a laugh, and people will come up with all sorts of really, really crazy, interesting types of things, which is no problem, okay? And so there you go. There's one exercise you can try. Now, another exercise, well, this is a little bit complicated, but if you have a look, it'll come up on your screen shortly. Here we go. Whoop, there it goes. Now, this is a little bit more analytical, and those of you who have an analytical bend may like to try to do something along these lines, but you don't have to, of course, but it's another way of looking at it. I'm just throwing a few things at you that might be helpful. So what you've got is 10 key dimensions of organisational culture, and this comes from the work of Robbins. And these 10 things are critical to explaining the culture of an organisation or a team. So here are they, and you could actually ask people, if you wanted to do this with your team, that is, or you could do it individually. You can do it now if you want. You could actually ask your team on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate each of these? So, for example, number 1, individual initiative, the degree of responsibility, freedom, and independence that individuals have to do their work. So if they had a high level of freedom, then you'd rate that a 4 or a 5. Or if it's very much people are told what to do and it's very regimented, it might be a 1 or a 2. Risk tolerance, the degree to which employees are encouraged to be aggressive, innovative and risk-taking. Now, I suspect in local government that's not going to be a very high score, nor should it be. So, but in a sales environment or a startup, that might be quite a high score. So how would people rate that? In terms of direction, the degree to which teams create clear, objective performance expectations. So are the KPIs very, very clear? And if they are, then it'd be a high score. Integration, the degree to which the team is encouraged to operate in a coordinated manner, people working collaboratively with each other. How would you rate that? And of course, inside a local government environment, you're going to have various functions, and all of these things will have an impact, of course, on the functions, and the functions will have an impact on the culture. Management contact, the degree to which the manager provides a clear communication, assistance and support to their team members, that's probably you. So how would people rate that? Or is it a very autonomous team? Is it a work gang that's out there doing their thing, they report back on what's done, but there's no direct supervision necessarily except for the ganger that might be in the crew. So the degree of rules and regulations and the amount of direct supervision. Okay. Identity, the degree to which members identify with the organisation as a whole rather than their particular work group or field of professional expertise. I find people, particularly in the outdoor environment, have a very strong identity to their team in the outdoor environment rather than the council itself. And that's not always a healthy thing, I might say. And that's often perpetuated that we're the real sort of we do the real work here, and we've got the pen pushers inside, and there's this kind of rivalry that goes on all the time. The reward system, the degree to which rewards are allocated on the basis of employee performance criteria. With local government, that's not going to be very high, of course. Conflict tolerance, the degree to which employees are encouraged to air their views. So is your team a team that encourages people to air their views in team meetings, and do people actually do that, and would you rate that high? Okay. 10. The communication patterns, the degree to which organisational commitments are restricted to the formal line hierarchy of command, a chain of command, if you like. Fortunately, that's breaking down in local government, but it's still pretty prevalent in lots of places. So that can be another more scientific, if you like, way of being able to get a handle on your culture in your workplace. And the reality is, because you're working in a regulatory environment, some of these things are what they are because of the very nature that you're a public organisation. All right. And so therefore, you're never going to have the same culture, of course, as a startup or it's just not realistic. But you might want to ask yourself the question, are some of the things here of these dimensions getting in the way of our performance that don't necessarily have to be there? That's what this auditing is all about. You can actually create a much clearer understanding of where the roadblocks are by doing this collectively with your team. So there's another one that you might like to try. It's up to you. If you're very detailed, you might like that one. If you like the other one about the colour, the animal and the vehicle, go for your life and try that. The big challenge that we've got in local government now and in the future, and I think it's here to stay, and I think there's enormous pressure now on organisations, particularly in local government, to become what they call ambidextrous. So O'Reilly and Cushman wrote a really interesting article in the Harvard Business Review many years ago, and they entitled it The Ambidextrous Organisation, which is a wonderful title, because if you're ambidextrous, it means that you can, use your right hand or your left hand with equal competence. So, for example, if you're a tennis player and you're ambidextrous, you can play left-handed or right-handed. It won't make a huge difference whether you're left-handed or right-handed. And there's very few people who have that ability. Most people, of course, have a natural tendency to be right-handed or left-handed. But applying that concept to the organisation is an interesting one, because what these two people who wrote this article basically were saying was that an organisation needs actually to be ambidextrous. So on the one hand, literally, it needs to be exploitative, hard to say, and the other needs to be explorative. So what do I mean by that? So look at the column on the left-hand side. So you've got costs. Profit may not be the word we use there. Might talk about surplus, but profit's not. Operations and efficiency, incremental innovation, operational, formal, mechanistic. These are the processes and the systems and the policies and the procedures that we use in order to run our organisations. So these are things that really are required because of the regulatory nature of local government. So those things, of course, have been the dominant hand in local government for many, many years, and arguably rightly so, because we don't want organisations to be freewheeling and all the rest of it when public funds are attached to it. But because of the pressures of local government now, in terms of funding, in terms of being able to increase rates and the pressures on people, local governments now have had to become far cleverer and innovative and continuously improving in order to be able to bridge that gap, to improve the way they provide their services. So if you look at the column on the right-hand side, more and more your team is expected to be the things that are on the right-hand side. So entrepreneurial, perhaps to some degree, innovative and thinking creatively outside the box, adaptive, meeting milestones, taking some prudent risks. So local governments are being forced to use another hand, and that is the hand of the flexible hand. So this challenge that you're facing is going to become more and more real. So the key for you is how, on the one hand, can we focus on the things that we have to do in a very functional, regulatory way, but then on the other hand, how can we create a culture that will allow us to be innovative? That's the real challenge for local governments moving forward. Now, what the ambidextrous organisation concept says is that you can be both. You don't have to be one or the other. But that's easier said than done, because, people can be confused about these messages, and some of your people in your team are probably confused about this. And because they're confused, they will probably revert to the left of your screen and do things the safe, predictable, analytical way, because then you can't get into trouble for that. Of course, if you go on the right-hand side, it's likely that you can potentially make mistakes or do things incorrectly, and of course get yourself into all sorts of trouble as a result of that. But one of the key things that I think you should try is, when you get your team together, draw 2 lines down the center of your page, if you like. Now, 2 lines down the center of your page, what that does is that, so you could use a whiteboard, and then you would say to people that on the left-hand side, you'd say to people, right, I would like you, let's all work out what are some things that are non-negotiable. We have to do them by the book. We have to do them absolutely explicitly, and there's no variation. We just have to do it a certain way. Now, this is in the context of your team, right? What work that you do. And you make a list, and you'll find that that list will be quite a long list. Now, if there's anything in there that you want to challenge, in other words, you're not convinced that it is one of those things that have to be very operational and specific to a particular approach, then challenge it. Or if anyone else in the team wants to challenge. But anyway, you end up with a list of things down that list. And then you've got a third column, and you go to the third column, and then you say to people in your team, what are some things that we have a free rein over, that we can do any way we choose? We have the freedom to decide how things are done. What are they? Now, you're going to find, obviously, that this list is going to be a lot shorter, and so it should be in your environment. But nevertheless, challenge people and push people to come up with some of those ideas, because if you don't identify them in your team, it's highly unlikely that anyone's going to exhibit the behaviour that you're wanting in those cases. So make a list, and then there's a middle column, and in the middle column I want you to say to people, now, what are some things that we do day to day, moment by moment, project by project, situation by situation, that could either be done by the book, or we could be quite innovative about it. In other words, this is the grey area between the two extremes. And then you write those down. And of course, again, if you want to challenge people and do that. But what I'm doing by doing that is a very, very interesting exercise. And it's not just interesting, it's very practical, because what it's doing is it's explaining to people the work they do and the freedom that they have to be ambidextrous. That over here are non-negotiable things that had to be done by the book, and you just do it by the book because that's the way it is. But on the other hand, over here we have a whole bunch of things where we can show our initiative, we can be a little enterprising and a little bit innovative. So we talk about those things. And then we make some decisions in the middle about whether or not it's appropriate to be following systems or being a little bit outside the box. That's that middle column. And that helps people, it gives people confidence in your team to know that it's okay to try certain things in certain situations, but in other cases you need to do things by the book. Does that make sense? I hope so. So it's a great way of promoting the concept of ambidexterity as far as it is concerned with your team. All right. So you're very quiet today, folks. Is any any questions or comments? Anything at all that you'd like to add to what I've said? You know, I'll let you decide. No pressure, but just thought maybe I've been talking too much, but I guess I have to. I can't stop talking. There'll be a silence at the end here. Now, while you might be thinking about that, another way, so I'm just throwing a few models at you, and of course you take out of this what you choose, and you take out of it what might work for you. Now, in one of my books, Performance Management for Agile Organizations, I developed this framework that you're looking at in front of you, or it's a model, I guess you could say. And in the model, you'll notice that there is a heading in the middle called Organizational Agility. And I think we talk a lot about being agile, don't we? And a lot of people have got no idea what that means in reality. And nobody, you know, it doesn't seem to be very practical. So I thought, well, what I could probably do is to put together a model which would demonstrate what that looks like. So that's what this model is. And so I felt that in order to say that your team is agile, whatever that definition is, it would have to meet these criteria. And so I'm going to run through these criteria, and you might like to think about your team in terms of these criteria. So this is the ambidextrous organization, but this is the agile part, you know, in the third column that we talked about. So starting at 12 o'clock, how innovative is your team? How willing are they to try new things, to play devil's advocate, to scrutinise the way things have been done for years and years and years? How good are they at doing that? And of course, the key to being innovative is not just to be innovative, but it's also to implement that innovation very quickly. So, of course, how quickly can we get a new way of doing it if we need a new way of doing it? Processing speed. How quickly can we process our people through our systems? So when a ratepayer makes an inquiry, or when someone wants something and it has to go through several different hands, how can we possibly make that as quick, as agile as possible and accurate at the same time? That's a perennial challenge for local government. How can we get things out the door faster with the same quality is the key thing. And when several different hands have to touch it, of course, it makes it more difficult because everyone only has a small piece of the bigger picture. Now, everybody makes mistakes. So the question then is, how do we recover from the mistakes that we've made? So when a local government authority makes a mistake, the question is not how can we cover up, but it's how do we actually recover from the mistake as quickly as we can. In other words, how can we rectify a wrong? That's the real essence of what it is to be an organisation. And, you know, so for example, just a simple example, if you're in a restaurant, you order a meal and they bring out the wrong serve and you point that out, they go away and they come back in 15 minutes with the right serve, then you're probably going to be less inclined to be critical than you would, of course, if it took 2 hours. Well, of course, if it took 2 hours, you probably would have left by then, but you certainly wouldn't be happy. So the question is, how quickly can we recover from our mistakes as a team? How good are we at continuously improving what we do? Now, there's a difference between innovation and continuous improvement. Innovation is all about implementing new ways of doing things whereas continuous improvement is all about improving on what we've already got. So it's making continuous improvements in the processes we already have. And I think that's probably more applicable in local government than innovation, to be honest. We just got a comment here. Complaints are a hard headache when you have Triple C and local government involved. Yeah, and it's always going to be challenging. So that's why it's really important to be crystal clear about where you can go out on a limb and make decisions, and where you have to stick stringently to the letter of the whatever it is. So if you don't encourage any sort of activity that is showing initiative and the like, then your organisation is not going to be performing, and you'll be criticised for not being a common sense organisation. You'll be criticised. So in other words, damned if you do and damned if you don't. So I think the process is to try to move towards that ambidextrous organisation as much as you possibly can, because by doing that, you are probably likely in the long run to be doing the right thing. But just playing it safe actually isn't safe, because, sure, you might not have the Triple C running after you, and of course that's not playing it safe. That's just being unethical and all the rest of it. But and of course we know what's been happening in a couple of councils. It's putting more and more pressure on local governments to be very, very compliant. And my concern with that, of course, is that the idea of an ambidextrous organisation or team is likely to take a step back as a result of that, because people are going to be more and more cautious now than they ever were before, and that probably isn't necessarily a good thing for local government overall. I'm not suggesting, of course, that people take huge risks, but we also want people to think and show initiative and all the rest of it, and that's what I'm really referring to here. Customer responsiveness is referring, of course, to an understanding that we're all here because we're serving our community. So our community is ultimate arbiters of whether we're doing our job effectively or not. So we have to be making sure that we are fast, we are responsive, we are value for money, and we're providing good service generally to the people that pay their rates. And that's a reasonably sensible way of looking at it. So how responsive are we to our needs in the community? Or are we dictating to our community what their needs should be? Of course, it's a bit of both, but we need to be making sure that we give people an opportunity to be responsive and receptive to the community. And it's very, very important we attempt to do that, because that's what we're here for at the end of the day. I mean, frankly, you're my customers, and the only reason that I'm here today is because you're in your jobs. And the only reason you're in your jobs is because there are people who want and need the services that you provide. So you can see it all goes back to the good old customer. We also want to be flexible in the way we solve problems. And this is important, of course, in local government, that local government problems are becoming more complex all the time, because there's more and more services being offered, and so as a result of that there's more complexity, and of course the members of the public have a far more educated understanding of what we do. They also, of course, have a clear or they believe they know what we should be doing. So it creates all sorts of interesting issues for us. Now you could argue that all of these things are about changing direction. So the next one on the list is changing direction. So how good are we at changing direction? How quickly can we change and respond to the needs that are necessary and change direction accordingly? How good are we at doing that? So again, you might want to give your team an opportunity to assess that. You might want to have a discussion about that. You might want to ask people to rate these things out of 5. It can be a very, very insightful question and a good way to promote that ambidexterity that I've been talking about earlier on. All right, so one other thing that you might like to try in your team, and it's a very good way of developing a excellent culture within your team, is to do what I refer to as a team values charter. Now, the team values charter was designed by me. It features in a couple of my books, and I've been very pleasantly surprised at how incredibly powerful it is. And it's simply based on the premise that you ask your team 4 simple questions, and you answer the 4 questions as well. And your first question is simply this. So you might call a meeting. You ask people to bring pen and paper if they don't normally, and you ask them the first question is, what's one value that's important to you when working in this team? So it should be this team. So this isn't about you don't have to get worried about this. This isn't the corporate values or, organizational values. This is just a set of values around how the team likes to operate when they're together as a team. So, for example, if I was a member of your team, I might just scribble down the word respect. So that's a value that I think is important. So everyone gets one value. And the next question you ask us is, what is your definition of that value? So now I have to define it, because respect means different things to different people, and it can be a little bit of a cliche unless I've defined what it actually means. So I might say to you, respect is when people are prepared to listen to others, even when they may not agree with that point of view. To me, that's respect. So I've written that down. And then question 3, you ask people, why is that value important to me? And that's very insightful, because it gives you as the team leader an opportunity to understand what makes people tick. So I might write down there, as example is, I like to feel that I'm respected and my opinion's valued when I'm working with others. That's why it's important to me. And the last question is where the rubber meets the road, and you ask what behaviours would be consistent with that value. And I might say not interrupting people when they speak. So in other words, this is a behaviour that is consistent with the value of respect. So you ask everybody to do that. That'll take you about, 10, 15 minutes. It's not difficult. They all write down their answers. Why do I want them to write it down? Well, because if you don't get them to write it down, it's just sort of ad hoc, fly by the seat of your pants. I want them to actually think about this. I want them to take it seriously. And that's why I'm asking them to write the answers down. So you actually get them to write it down. And it's best to do it in the room. I don't think it's a good idea to send this out first. Do it in the room, because some will come along having not done it, which is problematic. So then I actually start with myself, and I'll read out my value. I'll read out my definition of my value. I'll read out why it's important to me, and I'll read out what behaviours would demonstrate it as the team leader. And then what I do is I go round the table and I get everyone to do the same thing. And you will find that it's an incredibly good experience. And I've done this with lots and lots of people in all sorts of industries, including local government, and it works really well. And then what I do is I create what's called a team values charter, which is essentially a collection of all the values that have been spoken about at that meeting. And so what the charter really is the list of values and their definition. And I've seen some places in local government that I've worked in who've got that actually framed on the wall in their meeting room. I've found other places in local government have put it on their agenda item, what the values are and how they need to treat each other. And I find that it's one of the most powerful things that you can do. So don't be deluded in its simplicity. If you're looking at creating a value, you're looking at creating a culture in your team, you could do a lot worse than developing a team values charter. Now the argument is because it's their information. See, they're all contributing to this charter. The old saying is people don't argue with their own data. And because it's theirs, they're going to take it very seriously, and they will, and they'll do it right. So that's something you might like to give it a good shot. Okay, so a team values charter can be a very, very effective way of dealing with things. Yes, I agree. We should all listen, ready to understand, not just to reply. Excellent. Absolutely spot on. We are in the business as leaders of genuinely listening to what people have got to say. And of course, this charter is a really powerful way of doing that, I might say. And you might be surprised at how effective this is. And what you will find is that it's so powerful that what people will end up doing is they'll start pulling each other up for behaviour that they think is inconsistent with the charter. That's when you know it's working really, really well. So that's another thing you might like to try. And the last thing I'd like to finish up with before we do anything else is I'd like to talk about team identity. Now, team identity, and that is the identity of your team and how you create that, is based on three concepts. And of course, we've covered some of these already, but we haven't used these words. Boundary spanning, buffering, and bringing up boundaries. So what do they mean? Well, boundary spanning is the concept of building important alliances outside your team, across the organisation, and indeed beyond the organisation. So this is being able to know who to go to about what, and being able to create links with important resources. Now, as the team leader, you should be encouraging boundary spanning. In other words, your team can't do exactly what it's doing in isolation, can it? You're acquiring information, you're acquiring all sorts of things from other people within and beyond the organisation. Right, so that becomes really important that you create those alliances and networks beyond the team. Definitely one thing you can do. But the second point there is very interesting because that's buffering. That is you protecting the team so that the resources in your team are not being used for other purposes. So people are calling on some of your team and involving your team members in activity that's not directly related to what you're trying to achieve. So it's a very delicate balance between your team being responsive to the needs of others in the organisation and also being protective of its own resources. Very interesting balance, and sometimes we don't get that right. And the third element is about bringing up boundaries, and a lot of the activities that we've done today are about that. So this is creating a kind of an identity or a culture of what your team looks like, whether it's the animal, the colour of the vehicle, whether it's the 10 dimensions I went through, whether it's the team values charter, whether it's the agility framework I shared with you, whether it's the ambidextrous organisation. It's doing some of that work. And you can imagine what your homework as a result of today is going to be, of course. And your homework, of course, is now to implement a team culture strategy. So this is about you now starting to think about how you might implement a team culture. All right, so that's your homework for today. Now, of course, this is our last session. So I want to say thank you to all of you for your involvement. Many of you have sent me emails and told me war stories, and we've conversed outside this forum. And I just want to say thank you. I've enjoyed working with you all. I hope you've got something useful out of it. I won't go through the 6 units again because I did that at the beginning, but I'm really hoping that you have got some real value out of this session. And I've got other programs, lunch and learn programs I'm running through peak services or LGAQ. So if you have other people in your team that you feel will benefit, by all means contact the local government authority of Queensland, and of course you can get them registered in the program. So thanks, folks. I've enjoyed working with you, and I look forward to hearing your war stories. And I'm going to wish you all the very best, and hope that we might meet up another time. So thank you, guys, and all the very best, and thank you.